Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Sagittarius and Sagittarius rising for the month of February of 2019. Tonight I'm trying on a bit of an experiment, and I'm live streaming all of my horoscopes tonight simultaneously on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. As a bit of an experiment, we are doing so far so good. It's a bit late. It's a bit of a long slog. I'm not going to lie to you, yeah, let's take a look at your transits for February and see what's going on. All right, so the first thing I want to look at is the calendar, the planetary alignments calendar that shows the dates when different planets will move into different signs. And it also shows the dates of the two lunations, which is the new moon in Aquarius on the 4th of February and the full moon in Virgo on the 19th of February. The other calendar we want to look at is the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and where they'll end up by the end of the month. But for the most part, what I'm going to focus on today, which I hadn't been doing for the past few months, is looking at the animate feature in Solar Fire in order to get a sense for the exact planetary alignments that are going to be taking place this month. So let's jump right into it. One of the things I mentioned in the other horoscopes to some of the other rising signs is that there's not a lot of planetary or outer planet alignments or major outer planet changes this month in terms of planetary stations or outer planets changing signs and moving from one sign into another. So our main focus is going to be inner planet transits this month, especially in terms of sign ingresses. And in terms of that, there's a couple that we can focus on right away with Venus and Mars, where let's see, which one do we want to start with? Let's start with Venus, actually, because that's one of the ones that's been more noticeable recently, where in my horoscopes for January that I did with Cam White, we focused a lot on the Venus-Jupiter conjunction that was happening in Sagittarius this month in your zodiacal sign. And that happened and went exact. There it was, about 16 degrees of Sagittarius around the 22nd and 23rd of January. But by the time February opens, Venus has already cleared Jupiter and it's getting ready to depart from Sagittarius in your first house, and it's going to move into Capricorn and your second house of finances around February 3rd and February 4th. So, and that's basically the rest of the month for Venus, or the rest of February, is Venus transiting through Capricorn and moving through your second house of finances, where at different points it's going to conjoin different planets or aspect different planets. Like, for example, it conjoins Saturn at 16 degrees of Capricorn around February 18th. Then a few days later, on the 22nd, 23rd, Venus catches up with and conjoins Pluto at 22 Capricorn, and then eventually, just before it leaves the sign, it hits 29 degrees of Capricorn, where it squares Uranus at 29 degrees of Aries just before it completes that sign and moves into Aquarius. And then that's pretty much the end of February, because by then we're already into March. So what that means is that this transit is going to be one of the more characteristic transits that's going to be going on for the entirety of February for those of you with Sagittarius rising. So Venus transiting your second house can be a positive period for financial matters, and it can also be a nice counterbalancing transit that sort of puts some weight on the other end of things, where you may have been experiencing some greater challenges or tensions or restrictions in the area of finances over the course of the past year, as Saturn has been transiting through your second house since December of 2017. So one of the reasons I like this transit is that it's going to put a benefic in your second house, and that benefic is going to help to counterbalance, or in some instances, resolve some of the issues that Saturn has been raising for you as it's been transiting through that sector of your chart over the course of the past 12 or 13 months. So for some of you, that's going to, while Saturn going through your second may have been coinciding with a period of like restrictions on financial resources, Venus transiting through your second can sometimes free up a bit of money or give you a little bit more money temporarily than you had during other periods. In other instances, it may help you to figure out a way to resolve an issue with finances or possessions that you've been dealing with or wrestling with for a little while now, as Saturn has been transiting through that sign. And this seems to really peak around the time of the Venus-Saturn conjunction around the middle of the month, like around February 18th specifically, which is right when Venus exactly conjoins with Saturn. So sometimes Venus can also represent seeking help or getting help from a third party. So if there's somebody that you could reach out to for help in order to get advice or assistance with some of the sort of issues that you've been dealing with, or in order to improve your approach to this topic or this area of your life, then that would be a good proactive use of that Venus symbolism going through your second house over the course of the next month. So I like this transit. It's going to be especially more positive for those of you with night charts, because Venus tends to be more positive at night. And for those of you with night charts, some of the struggles with Saturn were probably a little bit more pronounced. Whereas for those of you with day charts, the Saturn transit was probably not as big of a deal, or has been a little bit more constructive. But then the counterpoint then is that the Venus transit itself will probably be a little bit less positive than it would be otherwise. So it's kind of a trade-off. So that's one transit that's going to be in effect for pretty much the entirety of February. The other major interplanet transit that I wanted to mention and focus on is Mars, which starts out the month transiting through Aries and transiting through your fifth house. And the fifth house has to do with children, creativity, also romance and like romantic affairs and things of that nature. So Mars is transiting through there for the first half of February, and we talked about that a lot in the horoscope for January, so you can go back and listen to that for more information. But what happens is that Mars ingresses into Taurus around February 14th, February 15th, and departs from the fifth house and moves into your sixth house. So the sixth house has to do with two primary significations. One of them is work and whatever it is that you do for work or your workplace. And the other major signification is health matters and matters pertaining to physical vitality. So Mars, in the best case scenario, especially for those of you with night charts, can make you put more focus and more energy on this area of your life than normal as it's going through the sixth house. So you may have to put more work into literally your work and your career during the course of the second half of February as Mars is going through Taurus. You may find that things are more strenuous or they're more stressful in your workplace during this time. And that's the more sort of constructive manifestation, is just like having to put in extra work, but then getting the results that are desired as a result of that. The other end of the spectrum can be sometimes getting into more challenges or obstacles or difficulties, or even having issues with anger or strife or conflict in the workplace while Mars is transiting through the sixth house. Since the sixth house also has to do with health, it can sometimes bring up sort of Mars-related health things that you have to deal with. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a new development. Sometimes it can just be putting greater focus on your health and having to proactively deal with things before they become a problem just by getting ahead of them. Other times, if there is some sort of like minor irritation or thing that coincides with the Mars ingress, then it'll be good to deal with that as sort of early on and head on. That way it doesn't become a more long-term sort of irritant as time goes forward. I did meant to mention, and I didn't want to completely skip with Mars transiting through your fifth house. For those of you with children, as I mentioned last month, it can be a period where you want to be careful about conflicts with children or having some sort of separation or strife involving that person in your life. This is also true of like romantic affairs, since that's something the fifth house also pertains to, and you want to be especially careful of that around the time of the Mars-Uranus conjunction. So best case scenario on the positive end of the spectrum, a Mars-Uranus conjunction can be a sudden, unexpected eruption of like passion or creativity as a more positive fifth house manifestation. But also sometimes the Mars-Uranus conjunctions can be very unstable and can be a little bit hard to deal with or hard to control, so that you kind of just have to let them go where they're going to go. And sometimes it can be a good ride along the way, but you have to just sort of like follow it wherever it takes you. And sometimes it can take you to kind of an unstable place So you want to be a little bit careful about that around, it looks like February 12th, February 13th, when that conjunction goes exact. So if that's, depending on the people in your life, depending on if you have a relationship, or depending on if you have children, it could pertain to either of those sort of areas, depending on the context of your life. And it could be a more sort of positive transit, especially for those of you with night charts where Mars tends to be a little bit more easy, or it could be a little bit more challenging and a little bit more disruptive for those of you with day charts, just because Mars tends to be a little bit more problematic in that context. All right, so that's the Mars transit. And like I said, the 5th house stuff is finished after the 14th, and Mars only gets up to about 10 degrees of Taurus by the end of February. So that transit of Mars through your 6th house of health and work is actually going to continue all the way through March. So it's really just sort of starting during the second half of February once Mars ingresses into that sign. And I meant to check actually the chat just to see if anybody has any questions as I'm going through and doing these delineations for Sagittarius and Sagittarius rising tonight. So if you guys do have any comments, please let me know, and I will try to get back to you when I can during the course of this. And actually maybe repost to those if you already posted a question that I didn't see, because I just opened the chat and may not see any earlier comments. All right, so let's take a look at the transit chart again. So I talked about the Venus transit through your 2nd house of finances, the Mars transit through your 5th house of children and into your 6th house of work and health. Other interplanet stuff that I meant to mention this month is the 2 lunations. So we have a new moon that's happening in Aquarius in your 3rd house of communication and short distance travel in, looks like on the 4th of February. So this is a new beginning or some sort of new development, a new chapter in your life with respect to the way that you communicate. It could also have to do with like mobility and how you get around your local area. The 3rd house also has to do with siblings, so it could be a new development with respect to your relationship with your siblings, if you have any. For other people, the 3rd house has to do with neighbors and extended family or extended relatives. So this is kind of this new moon is a little anticlimactic, since we're coming off of 2 years of solar and lunar eclipses that have been bouncing back and forth between Aquarius and Leo. And now this comes along and it's just a regular new moon in Aquarius. So in comparison or relative to those, it's relatively uneventful. But for some of you, especially those of you in like a Cancer or Leo perfection year where the lunations are more sensitive for you, then this could still represent a new beginning with respect to the way that you communicate things that could be significant or could develop more long-term significance over the course of the next 6 months as you build up to eventually having a full moon that will take place in Aquarius 6 months from now, or 6 months from February. So pay attention to what you're beginning at this time, because it could have more significant long-term ramifications than it might seem at first. And that's one of the tricky things about new moons, is that new moons start out very slowly and very suddenly, or very subtly, I should say. Because if you think about that symbolically, the new moon is when the moon is at its darkest. And then after that point, it very gradually starts increasing in light and getting brighter and brighter and brighter until 2 weeks later, eventually the moon is at its brightest at the full moon. But when it first conjoins the sun at the beginning of that cycle, it's very subtle and you don't realize at first what's happening and that the moon's actually getting brighter and brighter gradually until eventually peaking 2 weeks later. That's kind of what your experience is going to be with this new foundation or this new beginning with respect to your 3rd house, is a sort of subtle development or a subtle shift that occurs this month starting on the 4th that isn't really going to show its results completely until about 6 months later when we get the full moon in that sign. Yeah, so Nikki Moore through the Facebook comments points out that lots of stuff is happening below the horizon line all month. So that's a really good point. So the below the horizon tends to be the more personal houses, whereas the houses above the horizon tend to be the more public houses that have to do with like other people or our public life, whereas most of the houses below the horizon have to do with our family and our private life. So that's a really good point, that most of the activity, it seems like, that's taking place this month and during this part of the year is happening in the more personal houses, whereas later on things get a little bit more public during other parts of the year. The only sort of counterpoint to that is actually the second lunation, which I actually should talk about now, which is that full moon that's taking place in Virgo later in the month on the 19th. So that's the one transit that's happening this month in a more public house, where this is the opposite end of the spectrum from the new moon, which is like a new beginning. This is a full moon where there's some sort of culmination of events that was probably initiated 6 months earlier that's being brought to completion and is starting to come to fruition or bear fruit at this time. Since this is happening in your 10th house, it has to do with your career, your overall life direction, and your reputation. And since it's a full moon is when the moon is at its brightest and it's really shining light on that area of your chart. And when that happens in the 10th house, it can sometimes be a period in which you actually receive more light or more public recognition than at other times. So that's actually kind of an interesting contrast later in the month compared to most of the other transits that are going on earlier in the month that are more about like personal development. Is we have this one lunation that stands out that's much more public and much more career oriented than everything else that's going on. So that lunation takes place, that full moon takes place on the 19th of February. All right. Let's see. So other transits, I covered the Venus transit, I covered the Mars transit, I covered the two lunations. The only other one that I meant to mention is kind of a precursor transit, and this is the Mercury transit that's happening this month. So let me pull that up in Solar Fire. All right, so this gets us a little bit, we end up going a little bit far afield with this because it sort of takes us into some of the transits in March, and it's a little bit of a preview of one of the more major transits that's coming up in March. But we can see that by February 10th, February 11th, Mercury ingresses into Pisces and into your 4th house, which represents your home, your family, your living situation, and your private life, and also your parents. And Mercury is moving pretty quickly, and eventually, about mid-month, it conjoins Neptune at 15 degrees of Pisces around February 19th. So normally that would be a pretty quick transit that would come and go, and that would be about the end of it. But what happens is that after this point in the later part of February, Mercury starts slowing down and gets ready to station retrograde at the beginning of March. And then what's going to happen after that is that Mercury will go retrograde, and it's going to retrograde all the way back to mid-Pisces, where it will conjoin Neptune a second and a third time. So what that means is that we have a Mercury retrograde in your 4th house of your home, your living situation, and your parents, and it's also conjoining Neptune. So this is a bit problematic because Mercury retrogrades by default can sometimes coincide with periods of miscommunication, but that's really heightened and really ramped up when Mercury is making a hard aspect with Neptune at the same time. So you want to be careful because while most of this is going to be really relate to stuff that's not happening until March, in the second part of February, the later part of February, once Mercury enters its shadow and makes that first conjunction with Neptune, it's going to start setting up the sequence of events that will lead into and then will play out over the course of the retrograde cycle. So I just want to urge people to be a little bit cautious about the potential for miscommunication during that time that could have a more lasting sort of long-term effects, just because that's probably the primary keyword I would associate with a Mercury retrograde conjunct Neptune is the potential for miscommunication. And let's see, since that's happening in your 4th house, it could be a miscommunication that has to do with your home and living situation. If you're like relocating or you're getting a new place, be sure that you pay attention to your lease and you read it carefully before signing any documents that relate to like permanently moving into or relocating into a new situation, just to make sure that there's no crossed wires, or that there's no instances where you're signing up for something that you don't necessarily, you're not necessarily on board with, if you were clear about the matter. Additionally, for some people, if your parents still play a major role in your life, you want to be extra careful about communications with them. If there's any potential for sensitive communications with one of your parents or both where that could be problematic, then try to be sure just to sort of dot all of your I's and cross all of your T's, so that there's not a miscommunication that leads to a series of problematic circumstances in the following month in March. So that's a basic sort of piece of advice that I wanted to mention about that. And it's a little nebulous, and we'll have to spend more time on it next month once Mercury actually goes retrograde in the horoscopes for March. But again, I just wanted to mention it here, since the pre-retrograde shadow period often sets up the sequence of events, or puts into place the sort of precursors for those events that will later play out over the course of the 3-week retrograde period. So definitely pay attention to that. All right, so we're getting towards the end of this. So does anybody in the live chat have any other questions as we're sort of wrapping up? So I think somebody's asking about Mercury and Sag in the 5th, but I think that would relate to, or you would have a different rising sign. So we're primarily talking about those with Sagittarius rising for the purpose of this. So yeah, I don't think that would be relevant here necessarily. Okay, cool. So yeah, thanks everybody who joined the live stream and who's posting comments. It's a little bit late at night here in Denver, and probably in several other places, so not as many people are around at this point, but I'm trying to push forward with some of the other horoscopes, and I'm trying to decide about doing the rest tonight or wrapping it up and doing the rest tomorrow. But thanks everybody who's followed, and thanks to all of you that have been following the monthly horoscopes since I started doing them in June and July. If you'd like to be notified the next time I do a live stream, then be sure to subscribe on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/theastrologyschool, and also follow me on Twitter, where I'm also live streaming this at Chris Brennan 7 is my handle on Twitter. All right, guys, I think that's it for the horoscopes for February. So good luck. I hope you guys have a great month, and I will see you again next month for the horoscopes for March of 2019. So have a great month. I am signing off, and I will see you again next time. All right, bye.